So this is the most glamorous podcast ever.
I feel as though we're going back to the days of pirate radio, in that you're recording in the middle of the ocean, whilst I'm in a house in the home counties.
Exactly.
It, it's the first international episode of the WhatsOnStage podcast, because you are currently on a musical cruise, I believe.
A theatre cruise. So I'm on London Theatre at Sea, which is an absolutely brilliant event organised by Julian Bird on board the Queen Mary II. And I am literally sailing across the Atlantic. I mean, it is quite extraordinary. And, I look out of my window and there's blue sea and sun, and I've seen whales and dolphins. And then during the day, I can listen endlessly to people talking about theatre and singing and dancing, and it's just kind of blissful. Actually, it's kind of made for me. I'm having a very nice time.
It feels as though it's a recipe for an immersive production of Anything Goes, and
exactly.
you're going to encounter Robert Lindsay or Patti LuPone will come striding past in character at some point.
Yeah, no, and actually for me, I was saying last night that I think I used to talk a lot to Nancy about this, that I think that growing up, I had this kind of sense that what I wanted to be was to be in a little band of theatre makers and to be or dance makers. And I was very influenced by all these novels of the 30s, where basically sort of troops of friends kind of travel the world putting on a show. And I think in terms of that sense of theatre, I've always wanted just to be a sort of a traveling player. And, to be a traveling player, even in a little way, on board the Queen Mary is kind of a fulfillment of a dream, really. I mean, it's lovely. And the music's great. And we're having a coward day with Patricia Hodge. And, and we've had wonderful singing from people like Rob Houchen and Emma Kingston. And, it's just really wonderful. And I'm interviewing Simon Higlett, the designer, later this morning. So, but before that, I thought, well, I'll talk to you about the Tony Awards.
Yes, I was about to say, in the theme of traveling players, a slight focus on some of the British shows that have triumphed or not triumphed at this year's Tony Awards. I think it was relatively solid innings for shows that sort of were shipped over the Atlantic that might have started out in the UK, as far as I could tell.
Yeah, no, we should say hello, actually. Have we said hello?
Yes, gosh, we haven't. I always forget.
So efficient. So yes, let me say hello from me, Sarah Crompton, the critic for WhatsOnStage.
And me, Alex Wood. I'm the managing editor at WhatsOnStage.
In the second WhatsOnStage podcast, and a video special, all very exciting, and an awards special. So we've really pushed the boat out.
Quite literally, yes. I'm sure you had these ones lined up in advance just to get all the nautical puns in there.
But what was great is I've had a bit of time in New York, and before I started sailing, and you've been to see a lot of the shows. I suppose we should start with Merrily, We Roll Along, which sort of took as expected, took 2 performance awards and Best Musical Revival. So one for Jonathan Groff, friend of the pod, and Daniel Radcliffe, who we hope will be. What was your feeling about that, Alex?
I felt as though coming in, it was definitely the show to beat. It had come in with so much goodwill from the moment that it was on off-Broadway. And the sales were incredible when it first opened on Broadway. And the memory of Stephen Sondheim was always going to be the thing that it had in its favour. I remember seeing the show in the West End when it was a slightly different production and a different cast. But I remember watching it thinking, how on earth did anyone not think this was a masterpiece? And that's what Maria Freeman's beautiful direction and the whole thoughtfulness behind the creative team allowed, was adding this layer of conceptual clarity that you know, it makes complete sense to me that it was the one that cleaned up and beat Cabaret, which was obviously the big winner in the West End. So, you know, it was funny.
Tom Scott's design, didn't it? So that's the only Tony it took away, which sort of reflects how Cabaret's gone down here. It just hasn't landed in the same way. And it's always interesting when I'm always interested when you come to Broadway, because in some ways, because it seems a smaller place than the West End, people always talk. And so I kept meeting people talking about Cabaret and saying, oh, but you all loved it over there. And got the feeling that it wasn't going to, you know, do well in the same way as you've written about and what's the stage. It just didn't land in the same way. But Merrily, I felt incredibly emotional seeing it, because I saw Maria Friedman sing it in Leicester in 1992. And I think I've said this on the podcast before, but we when I was with Nancy, but we all went up in a bus from Coventry again. And it was a sort of huge thing for us to see that show and see the show that, had closed after 16 performances and 44 previews. But we Sondheim fans were convinced that it was a masterpiece. And seeing it in Leicester, it was a great show. But there is no doubt that Maria's direction has restored it to its real glory, and it makes sense. I think it's not confusing anymore. I think some of the early productions, because how Prince famously dressed everybody the same and nobody could tell who was who, and I think you need those characters to be very clear, because then the show works. And I really felt watching it, I was just overwhelmed how good it was, and how good the performances were. So Jonathan Groff is one, Daniel Radcliffe, who is, his best friend and sort of sidekick, and is amazing. It's a wonderful performance by Radcliffe. Lindsay Mendes, really sorry that she missed out on the third, because she actually anchors the trio of the friends who fall out. But everybody's good. I mean, everybody's good. And I find it kind of spine tingling to see this show that has struggled sort of suddenly come into its own. I think it's got better every time Maria's done it.
One of the things that struck me seeing Sonia Friedman, Maria Friedman, and David Babani, all of whom were sort of instrumental in this production's journey to Broadway, on stage, was how emotionally touched they all were by allowing it to have this moment and complete this almost half a century long journey to being recognized as a masterpiece in its own right. And that's through 2 shows in 3 years that are Sondheim productions that started in the UK under a female director, given a new lease of life and conceptual clarity, winning Tony Awards for Best Musical Revival after Marianne Elliott's brilliant version of Company. And it does feel as though we are hitting, or Sondheim's work is hitting this new stride posthumously, where all these devotees and people that absolutely adored him and worked with him for decades almost have taken the baton and have thought, we can do a brilliant service to this ultimate creative and this brilliant presence, and unlock his work. And the word "we're popular" suddenly was I think part of the speech as well, and it's unlocked Sondheim's work and allowed it to sit beautifully amongst some of the greatest literature, art ever written. And I'm really excited to see how that carries on. And I think we saw that with Stephen Sondheim's Old Friends, the way that the material was interpreted. Obviously, that is now Broadway bound as well. So this trajectory of shows.
And it's a new generation discovering him as well, so Rob Houchen and Emma Kingston sang a Sondheim last night. I mean, it is like a new generation of discovery, sort of guided by the acolytes in a way. And I think Sondheim did need acolytes. There's a weird side fact, which you probably know because you're good at data. I'm going to share this one with you, that and I learned this from Richard Schoch, who the professor of drama at Queen's Belfast, who's also on this cruise there. Jonathan Tunnock, who won for Best Orchestration last night, he was nominated for a Tony in the disastrous opening and didn't win. And so he's got, I mean, there's a kind of absolute kind of historic vindication of his work orchestrating Sondheim. And so that's also a kind of nice, yeah, footnote to it, really. I'm sorry, Maria Friedman didn't win, but I didn't see The Outsiders. So the show I missed was The Outsiders. I did really well what I saw, because we'll come on to Stereophonic. But Dania Tamor, I gather, is a real talent to watch. I suspect it's sort of, you know, it's bad luck for Maria to come up against her, because I think there is great excitement around her direction. Did you see The Outsiders when... Have you seen...
No, unfortunately not. But I think in that category, what was most wonderful was seeing 4 out of 5 of the nominees all being women. And, you know, that's pretty much unprecedented in a world where, you know, the male auteur directors are often the ones handed the reins for these big blockbuster musicals, and actually saying, look, no, that's just that should be a relic of the past, really. And I was struck watching The Outsiders performance about how fresh it felt as a musical, and I think that was quite true of a lot of the nominees, that they all felt that there was a big opportunity for experimentation and, you know, forward thinking in terms of how we can present these big shows, you know, like Hell's Kitchen, Suffs, The Outsiders, Illinois, all felt like they had very distinct personalities, and shows that felt like they could come to the UK and be new and interesting in the same way that something like Hadestown has come back to the West End and felt like it can sit in its own bubble, which is really exciting for UK viewers, I suppose.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, because sometimes you come to Broadway, and I mean, I really love Broadway. I always get kind of quite starry-eyed. But you do sometimes think it's kind of a bit set in its ways, and it's a bit traditional compared. And, you know, it's really hard to make, I think, to make experimental theatre in America. It's really hard to make experimental theatre in Britain, but it's really hard. You know, the funding model is even more complicated, I think, for experiment. And it is brilliant that these these kind of radical shows have been rewarded. I love the fact that Suff's got Best Book and Best Score. So even though it didn't win, it's an acknowledgement of a really significant musical about an interesting subject. And you know, Illinois for Best Choreography, obviously I was really interested to see that started out at the Fisher Center at Bard, so that's been sort of developed as an experimental project. And I thought it was a fabulous show, a musical without words. I mean, in a sense, you know, you kind of keep waiting for the cast to speak, and they don't, they just dance it, and it's so clear. I mean, you know, hats off to Jackie Sibblies-Drury for the clarity of her storytelling. Yeah, so that feels right, that got choreography. There's a kind of sense in which you feel that this is a Tony season where they've made nods to lots of things.
Yes. One of the interesting statistics that I found with my statistics hat on was that, you know, of the first 9 awards of the evening, they all went to different shows, which was really an interesting thing. That, like you say, it was a very evenly spread season. So a lot of shows right now are probably painting the words Tony Award winner onto their marquees, which is great for Broadway in some ways, because if it's, you know, the Tony Awards help them, the shows, with their longevity or staying afloat or staying open, then lots of people are going to be coming away quite happy this morning, I hope.
Yeah, no, I totally think so. I really think so. And I think I like that. It feels as if people have been watching, and it kind of reflects a sense that I did have when I was there. I wasn't there very long, but just that sense that it's a good Broadway at the moment. There's a lot of really good stuff. And of course, Stereophonic, which the most nominated straight play ever. So 13 nominations, came away with 5 awards. I think that makes it the night's big winner, doesn't it? Along with Merrily, actually, Merrily and Stereophonic. But I mean, my socks were knocked off because I deliberately hadn't read anything about it, so I really didn't know what I was going into. And I thought,
what was it that struck you most?
Well, because I didn't know what I was going to see, all I knew was it was a play about a band. And I think I didn't realize how formally experimental it was going to be. So when you walk in and David's in set is just it is a recording studio. And so you've got the front is the mixer desks where everybody comes to talk, and the back is the recording booth. That's a surprise anyway. The fact that the actors all play their own instruments to such a high level is amazing. I mean, just a small thing. So you sort of think they're musicians who act, then you realize they're actors who play. And just the tone of it, the tone of it is so amazing. I thought of just, it's like, so I love Annie Baker. And it seemed to me that it had a similar way of just saying, okay, here I am going to put on stage in front of you a chunk of life. And, you know, I think David Jeremy's writing is just pinpoint, gorgeous. Just, and I was completely knocked sideways by it. Everything's costumes, amazing, fabulous. And I felt really excited. Presumably it's coming to London. I mean, you know, it's got British producers involved.
I may have been speaking to one of said producers at the Olivier's recently, and she gave a strong hint that it wouldn't be too long from our shores, hopefully. So we can then I can hopefully have more to give back to you and my own inputs on the show. But, you know, from everyone that I've spoken to, again, it felt like the show to beat. It didn't really feel like it could ever have gone a different way. Yeah. And that's the thing with these sort of, I think with Broadway, they know how to campaign really well. They've got the machine down in terms of creating the right hype and momentum for their shows. And obviously it helps when the show's very good, but everything around the show felt very slick, very premium.
Yeah.
And felt like it would be beneficial for everyone for this to win the Tony Award for Best Play.
Well, it's genuinely, I think, rewarding innovation. It feels, it's quite hard to describe why it's innovative, because it's just, in a way, it's just, you know, story of a band, story of an album. But there is something about the density of the writing and the fact that it manages to deal with quite a lot about relationship. I mean, you can see quite a lot of what's going to happen, and Fleetwood Mac are never very far from your mind, in terms of how, you know, the dynamics of these 2 women and 3 men play out. But nevertheless, it has elements that are surprising, and it doesn't overstate anything. I had to talk with another producer who perhaps I shouldn't name, because they'd come over and they'd look at a lot of things, and they felt quite strongly that Stereophonic was too long, because it is 3 hours. And I mean, I love a short play, but I thought, and I can see, you know, that you can cut it. I mean, I could cut chunks now, but I think it would lose by cutting. It's something about creating an immersive world and just asking you to sit there very patiently and walk into it and go with it. And you know, one of the other things that struck me about Stereophonic and about Illinois particularly is it brought in a different Broadway audience. It's a younger audience in both cases, and it's a more I thought it was a more, not engaged, because I always think Broadway audience is quite engaged. It's a more listening audience. There's a sense of kind of leaning in to both of them. And I think the length of Stereophonic asks you to do that, and that people do kind of go with it, really.
It's funny, I think, if you look back on shows like The Inheritance or even Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, you know, the long durational 2-parters, there is that thing where this is so long that there's no point even looking at your watch, because you're going to be here all night. You might as well just shut anything else out and lean in, like you say. And some of the best moments in theatre are where very little / nothing is happening, because that's when everything that's just happened is allowed to marinate and simmer, and you can chew on it in the ways that you want as an audience member.
Yeah.
Which I always find very interesting.
And also Stereophonic is doing that thing that I think we've had a lot of in the West End, and I think it's becoming more and more a thing, it's about sound and what you listen to and what you don't. So because it's in the recording booth and because there is literally a sound control on the stage, I mean, it rightly won for stage for sound design, but that's so interesting about how they play with that, and so that events happen that you can't see but you hear, and events you can see and not hear, and that requires a level of kind of concentration and engagement that is fascinating. And it's fascinating in a world where you know we might in a later podcast have a discussion about the entry of technology to theatre, but it is really interesting about, in a world where we're bombarded with sound and images, that in a theatre you somehow having that controlled, and the suggestion of who's in charge of what you see, what you hear, whose story it is, who's telling it, who's engaged, suddenly becomes sort of almost part of the plot, really.
This is a slight tangential. I think I'm building on this in the segue. The sound and video side of things and who's controlling them instantly reminds me of Sunset Boulevard. Obviously, we got a wonderful performance from Nicole Scherzinger during the In Memoriam section, which was essentially a teaser for her upcoming Broadway run, following her multi-award winning turn as Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard in the West End. And that was a very video sound heavy production, where importantly, you saw the videographers moving across the stage. You were allowed to see almost how organically the video was made. It was a digital innovation, but it actually felt very organic. It didn't feel like digital because you could see the cameras and you could see the wires and you could see the people that were there spotting the camera operators so they didn't trip over. And that for me was sort of brought me onto the topic of that interaction between the West End and Broadway. I think this year we were talking about Cabaret to some extent, but even shows like Back to the Future, which won Best New Musical at the Olivier Awards, was almost entirely shut out at the Tonys. And Cabaret, again, big winner at the Oliviers, getting one Tony Award. And ironically, it was a Tony Award that it didn't actually win at the Oliviers because Tom Scott was locked out of that category by Life of Pi at the Olivier Awards for Best Set Design, because in the UK we don't differentiate between plays and musicals for the creative categories, whereas they do on Broadway. So great moment for Tom Scott, but again, raising some interesting questions around how do shows land on Broadway versus the West End, and how do our audiences or critics differ? And therefore, is that the sort of thing that's playing into the mind of the Sunset Boulevard producers as they're gearing up for their Broadway run? How is Nicole Scherzinger's Norma Desmond going to go down, and will it be treated differently to Cabaret, because Sunset Boulevard is obviously quite a largely UK sort of grounded production. It's a UK writing team, Andrew Lloyd Webber obviously. So are we allowed therefore to play around with that musical in a more radical way than perhaps critics might have been slightly annoyed about the way that Rebecca Frecknell played around with Cabaret, as they seem to? There seem to be a lot of arguments levied at her on social media that, oh, you don't understand the material, you don't understand what's happening here, which was a very interesting discourse to read almost after the show opening in 2021 in the UK, when everyone was just so on board with what she was saying about class identity and the sort of the subtle rise of fascism. It didn't feel like that was really part of the conversation in the US, and therefore, how will that go then? How will that same pool of creatives and critics treat Sunset Boulevard come this October? I think it's October this opening.
Yeah.
That's going to be really interesting.
It will
really
be interesting and hard to predict, actually. And I also suspect in terms of success, it's a question of which audience it lands with as well. So I think, the one of the problems I think with Cabaret is that everybody was expecting something and they got something different. And there is something kind of, and also I think there is that sense is this is such a sweeping generalization and probably unfair, but the Americans do have a particular view of the musical, I think, the musical as a form. And I actually think they do it best. I mean, I absolutely think, seeing a musical on Broadway there is nothing like it, because they are absolutely confident in what they're doing, and their dancers and their singers are just the best. And I wish I had seen The Outsiders, because that feels like that might be the kind of next great sort of American musical. And so Illinois, though I loved it, a lot of people I talked to and just en passant were kind of irritated that it was in the musicals category, because they kept saying, "Oh, what is a dance show?" That to me is quite interesting itself, you know, because actually Broadway does have this tradition of dance shows, essentially, you know, Fosse and so on, that don't necessarily conform to the musicals model. But I think revivals, there's always this sense that you can't, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, you can't mess too much, which brings us back to Sondheim, you know, that I think the Brits have been much more willing to sort of not mess around with Sondheim, but see him through a different lens. And that's really helped him. There's no doubt Company benefited from that. There's no doubt that Merrily has benefited from kind of rigorous reviewing. So it will be interesting to see what happens with Sunset, because that is the same process. Jamie Lloyd has really looked hard at that show. And I think Lloyd Webber has been quite brave in saying, fine, go for it. Because, you know, it's a gamble. So it will be really, really interesting to see how people respond. And yeah.
It was at the opening night in the West End, when we were talking to Jamie about the show, he was discussing how he is always very, very keen for, when shows are sung, they are sung incredibly well. You know, he's not one for the sort of, and I think there's this, it's slightly in vogue, maybe there's that European trend of the more sort of shouty avant-garde delivery of musical numbers. He is very anti that, and I think almost he's playing more into the Broadway tradition of, when you have this incredible material, you have to deliver it with panache, with, you know, properly trained, incredibly strong performers, like Nicole Scherzinger proved herself to be when she was doing the In Memoriam section yesterday. You know, it was note perfect, and when she was in Sunset Boulevard, it was note perfect. So maybe that's something that will play into Sunset Boulevard's favor. But to your point about Brits being able to take musical revivals and do something that allows to place them in a new lens and allows them to thrive, I think the Meunier Chocolate Factory, which obviously was where this Merrily We Roll Along originated, has got an amazing track record for that now, with obviously The Colour Purple, which won Best Musical Revival, opened at the Meunier and then transferred across and was sort of a huge star maker for Cynthia Erivo. Yeah. And then even, I think, Funny Girl proved to be a huge financial hit. And that was, you know, the seeds of that production started in a small intimate stage in South London. So maybe it's something about, you know, if when Broadway embraces the British interpretation, it can really go gangbusters in terms of the results.
Yeah, and just, I mean, just pulling to an end, and partly because it is Jonathan Groff who talked to Nancy Carroll and I on a previous podcast, as the actress said to the Critic, and partly because he's just a wonderful man. There is something utterly sensational about seeing him in that role. And, I mean, he's British, isn't he, Jonathan? I've not made this up.
No.
Or is he
American? He's not. Just
right.
He's American, I think.
Okay, sorry. But seeing, because actually I was thinking, is he British? But he is an absolute Broadway leading man. There is no doubt. That's what he is. That's who he is. And that suddenly makes that role, the central role of Frankie Merrily, it just has such clarity as a performance and such power. And I think that's, yeah, that was, you know, from the Meunier to that is a great journey, and with a lot of people's talent involved. But he does make it glee. That central trio, him and Daniel and Adini and Lindsay, absolutely make it glee. I thought it was great. So, well, that is right to the end, perhaps.
Yes, I know my. Well, hopefully, it sounds as they might be recording the production for some sort of digital live. So hopefully we can all.
I have heard too that they're doing a very high-end digital recording, so we will all get to see it, which is really what that.
Hooray! Yes, I can't wait. Hopefully, we'll get a preview of it on this podcast, and we can we can do a watch along narration.
Yeah, no, it'd be brilliant. But perhaps we should stop there. Have you got anything else you want to say? Have you got any other
No.
I've exhausted
I mean,
my
I
enthusiasm. I need to go and eat one of my many breakfasts.
my experience of Americans was seeing Taylor Swift at Anfield, so slightly outside of the theatrical fold. But she did say one interesting thing that maybe we could pick up on a future podcast was that the thing that she enjoys most is watching the crowd, the audience perform to her. And I think the way in which audiences perform to performers is really fascinating and something that I think we could maybe pick up on a rainy day in a future episode.
Why don't you talk to me about Taylor Swift? I was quite jealous, actually. It's quite hard to be jealous of anybody when you're cruising the Atlantic. Well, I was quite jealous of you being at Taylor Swift. Was it brilliant?
Also, I think a lifetime of going to the Globe prepared me for queuing for 8 hours from very early in the morning for standing seats, and by the end of it, I'd kind of forgotten what my legs were meant to feel like. But she is just one of the most incredible show makers in the world, and you can sort of see how she thinks about the audience in the way that she blocks her performance. She will come out right the way onto her thrust stage, and she'll make sure that she gets every touch point so that everyone in that crowd feels like they've been close to her for 1 or 2 or 3 moments. And there's also really innovative video design going on the back screen that I think a lot of West End or stage productions could learn a lot from, actually. But that understanding that people have paid a lot of money to see her, and even if they see her as a tiny speck, hundreds of meters away, she wants to make sure they feel special. She also seemingly has this ability that she always wants to make sure she sees as many people in the eye as possible. So you can see every second she's thinking, who am I catching? Who am I catching? Who am I catching? And you can tell that that's part of her process in terms of finding those connections with people, that they will have that split second and they'll treasure that for the rest of their lives. And forming that connection with her fans has been so instrumental to her success, even if it's been during COVID or digitally on social media. But she does it in a very sort of casual, relaxed way, just by making eye contact with someone that I found really fascinating. As a critic that had been standing in the rain for 8 hours in Liverpool.
That is interesting to use theatrical technique in a rock performance, and yeah, amazing, jealous.
Yes. Well, I'm going back next week to see her in Wembley. Okay. So it's a two-parter. But
a two-part on the podcast, by which time I will have landed in Southampton and will be back in South London.
Reunited. Yes. Well, perfect. I think that's a great point in which to wrap up this Tony's episode. Next week, we will be examining, I think, the different election manifestos and what they might mean for the arts. So make sure you subscribe, save, like, and share so you never miss any of these theatrical witterings. And that's all from us this week. Have a lovely one.